In the shadow of towering skyscrapers and bustling Wall Street, a financial storm brews that few see coming. The United States national debt has ballooned to an unthinkable $38.4 trillion, a figure so vast it dwarfs the entire global economy of just a few decades ago. But here's the unsettling truth. This colossal burden isn't being paid off through heroic austerity or bold defaults. Instead, the government is quietly erasing it through a stealthy mechanism known as soft default or financial repression. This isn't a conspiracy whispered in dark corners. It's a deliberate policy playbook honed over decades that pays back creditors with dollars worth far less than when borrowed. Inflation becomes the silent thief, devaluing savings while propping up the illusion of solvency. Interest payments alone are projected to top $1 trillion in 2026, more than the entire defense budget. Yet the machine churns on, printing the difference and fueling a wealth transfer from everyday Americans to the elite. In this documentary, we'll peel back the layers of this economic sleight of hand, exploring the debt spiral that's ensnaring us, why traditional escapes are impossible, and how mechanisms like captive bond buyers, manipulated inflation metrics, and fiscal dominance are reshaping society. We'll uncover the Cantillon effect's role in widening inequality and the death of risk-free saving, and the looming specter of central bank digital currencies as the ultimate control tool. By the end, you'll see why the winners own scarce assets like gold, Bitcoin, and real estate, while those clinging to cash face ruin. This is the story of America's polite bureaucratic default, and how it spells the end of the American dream as we know it. To understand the gravity of this situation, we must first delve into the origins of the debt spiral, tracing its roots back through American history to see how we arrived at this precarious moment. The United States has always borrowed to fund its ambitions, from the Revolutionary War, where the Continental Congress issued paper money that famously became not worth a continental, to the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln's administration floated bonds to finance the Union effort. But the modern debt era truly began after World War II, when the U.S. emerged as the world's superpower with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 106% in 1946. Back then, the government employed financial repression to manage it, capping interest rates below inflation through Regulation Q and other controls, while strong economic growth, averaging 3.5% annually in the 1950s, and moderate inflation whittled the ratio down to 50% by 1960. This set a precedent. When debt becomes unmanageable, inflate it away rather than confront it head-on. The post-World War II period offers a classic example of financial repression in action. During the war, the Federal Reserve agreed to peg interest rates on short-term government bonds at an extremely low 0.375%, a policy that extended into the post-war years until the Treasury Federal Reserve Accord of 1951. This peg, combined with widespread rationing, restrictions on consumer credit, and war bond drives, boosted savings and facilitated the sale of government securities. The result was a steady decline in the debt-to-GDP ratio, not primarily through economic growth alone, but through a combination of primary budget surpluses, surprise inflation, and repressed interest rates. As economists Julian Ackland and Lawrence Ball noted in their 2024 IMF working paper, without these distortions, the debt-to-GDP ratio would have only fallen to 74% by 1974, not the actual 23%. This historical episode demonstrates how governments can use repression to liquidate debt, but it also highlights the costs: distorted capital allocation, reduced investment, and eroded savings for ordinary citizens. Fast forward to the 1970s, and the seeds of today's crisis were sown. The Nixon shock of 1971 ended the gold standard, severing the dollar's tie to precious metals and unleashing fiat currency's full potential for expansion. Stagflation ensued, high inflation coupled with stagnant growth, forcing Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker to hike rates to 20% in 1981, taming inflation but causing a recession. Debt began climbing again under Reagan, who cut taxes while boosting military spending, pushing the national debt from $900 billion in 1980 to $2.6 trillion by 1988. The 1990s saw a brief respite. Clinton's balanced budgets and tech boom reduced deficits, but 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan reversed that, adding $10 trillion under Bush and Obama. The 2008 financial crisis accelerated the spiral. Bailouts and restrictions on consumer credit boosted savings and facilitated the selling of government securities. These wartime policies were complemented by the Fed's 1942 agreement with the U.S. Treasury to peg interest rates on short-term government bonds at the extremely low rate of 0.3%. The Fed maintained the interest rate peg until well after the war, ending the arrangement with the Treasury Federal Reserve Accord of 1951. Policies of financial repression became increasingly important in the United States during the 1960s and 1970s, and their role was intimately tied to the Bretton Woods system, its growing and unsustainable imbalances, its demise, and the great inflation that followed. Whereas the immediate post-war period was marked by dollar shortages among the major non-US economies, the economic miracles of Germany, Japan, and other countries dramatically changed the picture. By the 1960s, Japan and Germany were running persistent current account surpluses, and the United States found it increasingly difficult to maintain the dollar's 35-ounce peg to gold. To sustain the peg, while maintaining the latitude for discretionary monetary policy, the United States imposed a new type of capital control in 1963 called the interest equalization tax. As inflation and U.S. Treasury rates increased during the 1970s following the collapse of Bretton Woods, the distortionary effects of U.S. interest rate ceilings, known as Regulation Q ceilings, became more pronounced. Authorized by the Banking Acts of the Great Depression, Regulation Q prohibited banks from paying interest on demand deposits, such as checking accounts, and allowed the Fed to set interest rate ceilings on bank time and savings deposits. Originally, there had been several motivations for Regulation Q, but two of the more important goals were to restrain speculative competition among banks and to encourage country banks to lend more in their communities and divert smaller amounts of funds to deposits at money center banks. The 2008 financial crisis was a brief respite. Clinton's balanced budgets and tech boom reduced deficits, but 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan reversed that, adding $10 trillion under Bush and Obama. The 2008 financial crisis accelerated the spiral. Bailouts and stimulus packages ballooned debt from $10 trillion to $20 trillion by 2016. Enter the Trump and Biden eras, where deficits became normalized. Trump's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act slashed corporate rates from 35% to 21%, adding $1.9 trillion to the debt over a decade, per the Joint Committee on Taxation. The COVID-19 pandemic was the tipping point. $6 trillion in stimulus checks, PPP loans, and unemployment benefits pushed debt from $23 trillion in 2019 to $31 trillion by 2022. Biden's American Rescue Plan and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act added another $6.2 trillion. Now, in 2026, under the returned Trump administration, policies like extended tax cuts and new tariffs are projected to add $3.4 trillion more by 2034, according to the Congressional Budget Office's updated baselines from December 2025. The debt clock ticks relentlessly. Every second, $100,000 is added per the U.S. debt clock. The spiral is mathematical inevitability. The formula is simple. Debt net required T+1, debt T plus, deficit T plus, interest T. With interest rates at 4 to 5%, even small deficits compound. In FY 2025, the deficit was $1.8 trillion, but interest alone was $970 billion net, up from $659 billion in 2023. As rates rose post-pandemic. The Treasury's monthly statement for November 2025 showed $89 billion in interest, paid that month alone, a 14% year-over-year increase. If rates stay elevated, the 10-year Treasury yield averaged 4.2% in 2025, and growth falters. GDP growth was 2.5% in Q3 2025. The ratio worsens. Economists like Kenneth Rogoff, in his 2025 update to This Time is Different, warn that once debt exceeds 90% of GDP, growth slows by 1% annually, creating a feedback loop. Demographics exacerbate this. The baby boomer retirement wave peaks in 2026-2030, with Social Security outlays projected at $1.5 trillion in 2026, up 5% from 2025. Medicare costs rise 7% annually due to aging and healthcare inflation. The Social Security Administration's 2025 report estimates the trust fund depletes by 2034, forcing 21% benefit cuts without reform. Revenues can't keep up. The Tax Foundation notes that even if taxes rose to European levels, 40% of GDP, entitlements would still overwhelm. Corporate tax revenues fell 10% in 2025 due to deductions, while individual taxes rose only 3% amid wage stagnation. Geopolitical factors add pressure. China's reduction of treasury holdings to $750 billion in 2025, the lowest since 2009, forcing domestic absorption. Russia and Saudi Arabia diversify into gold and yuan. Foreign buyers, once 50% of debt holders, are now 30%, forcing domestic absorption. The International Monetary Fund's October 2025 World Economic Outlook warns that U.S. debt sustainability is at risk, with potential for sudden stops if confidence erodes. Why are conventional exits impossible? Austerity requires draconian measures. To balance the budget, cuts of $2 trillion annually, eliminating all discretionary spending, including education, $80 billion in transportation, $100 billion, or tax hikes equivalent to 10% across the board. The last major austerity, Greece's 2010 bailout, led to 25% GDP contraction and social unrest among aging populations. In the U.S., Simpson-Bowles in 2010 proposed $4 trillion in savings over a decade, mixing cuts and revenue, but Congress ignored it. Today's polarized politics make it worse. Republicans block tax increases. Democrats defend entitlements. Polls from Pew Research in December 2025 show 65% of Americans oppose Social Security cuts, 70% resist Medicare reductions. Explicit default is apocalyptic. The U.S. borrows in its own currency, but default would shatter trust. Treasury securities are the world's risk-free asset. Default spikes global rates, crashes pensions, holding $4 trillion in treasuries, and ends dollar hegemony. As Janet Yellen testified in 2025, even the threat of default harms America's credit. The 2011 debt ceiling crisis cost $1.3 billion in higher borrowing per GAO. A real default? Think Lehman Brothers on steroids. Stock market plunge 50%, unemployment to 15%, global recession. So, soft default it is. This involves engineering inflation higher than interest rates, eroding debt's real value. In 2025, headline CPI was 2.7%, but true inflation, factoring shelter, up 3%, food, 2.6%, energy, 4.2%, felt higher. The Fed's 2% target is flexible. Powell's December 2025 Jackson Hole speech hinted at tolerating 3 to 4% for labor market stability. Historical precedent, post-Wabu rates were capped below inflation via controls, shrinking debt from 106% to 50% of GDP by 1960. Today, it's subtler. QE and forward guidance suppress yields. In 2025, the Fed ended QT in December, shrinking the balance sheet by $2.4 trillion from $8.9 trillion peak, but resumed short-term Treasury purchases, RMPs, to maintain ample reserves, seen as de facto QE. This injects liquidity, keeping rates low. Yields on 10-year Treasuries averaged 4.2% in 2025, below historical norms given debt risks. The goal? Inflate away 3 to almost 4% of debt annually. At 4% inflation for 10 years, $38 to almost $4 trillion debt halves in real terms. But savers lose. $10,000 today buys half as much in 2036. Mechanisms abound. Captive buyers. Regulations force banks, insurers, pensions to hold treasuries. Basel III requires high-quality liquid assets. Treasuries qualify. In 2025, banks held $3.5 trillion in treasuries per Fed data, creating artificial demand. The Fed's BTFP and discount window backstop this, ensuring buyers despite risks. This suppresses rates. Without captives, yields would spike to 6 to 7%, exploding interest to $2.5 trillion annually. Manipulated CPI. Since 1980s, changes understate inflation. Substitution bias assumes consumers switch to cheaper goods, e.g., steak to chicken. Hedonic adjustments deduct for quality improvements, e.g., faster computers mean lower price. Geometric weighting downplays volatile items. The Boston Commission, 1996, found 1.1% overstatement, leading to tweaks saving $1 trillion in entitlements over decades. Critics like Shadowstats estimate true inflation at 6 to 8% using pre-1990 methods. In 2025, official CPI at 2.7%, but food up 2.6%, shelter 3%, energy 4.2%, real felt inflation higher, gaslighting citizens while curbing COLAs. The 43-day federal shutdown in 2025 disrupted data collection, forcing BLS to carry forward September values for key metrics like owner's equivalent rent, adding to questions about the 2.7% figure. Fiscal dominance. Fed independence wanes, it now props Treasury. In 2025, foreign buyers waned. China reduced holdings to $750 billion, forcing Fed intervention. Ending QT and RMPs echo QE, printing to buy bonds, inflating assets. The everything bubble, S&P up 25% in 2025, housing prices 5% higher despite rates. But operating losses? Fed lost $114 billion in 2025, deferred as assets. The Cantillon effect explains inequality. Named after Richard Cantillon, it describes how new money benefits first recipients. QE injects via banks, boosting assets before inflation hits wages. In 2025, wealth gap widened. Top 1% captured 60% of gains per Fed data. Gini coefficient hit 0.42 in 2025, highest since 1929. Top 1% wages rose 182% since 1979, bottom 90%, 44%. Examples: Bezos' wealth grew $20 billion in 2025 stock rally. Median income stagnated at $75,000, eroded by 3% inflation. K-shaped economy, post-COVID, rich recovered fast, poor lagged. Risk-free saving dies. Treasuries yield 4% below 5% true inflation, negative real return. Traditional advice, save in bonds, now loses money. Savers turn speculators. Stock ownership hit 62% in 2025, crypto 20%, but volatility rises. March 2025 dip wiped 10% from S&P. CBDCs loom as control mechanism. Trump banned U.S. CBDC in January 2025 executive order, citing privacy risks. But globally, China's eCNY, used by 300 million, enables expiry dates, negative rates. Europe's digital euro pilots 2027 tracks transactions. U.S. ban protects anonymity, but Fed now expands. Pressure from inflation may reverse. As Christine Lagarde said in 2025, CBDCs ensure monetary sovereignty. In conclusion, this slow default enriches asset owners. Gold up 20% in 2025 to $2,500 Oz, our Bitcoin 100K. Real estate 5%. Profitable businesses thrive. Losers, cash holders, fixed income retirees. The American dream: save, buy home, retire, dead. Adapt.